Maybe the best way to describe this presentation, it's based on a paper that came out in Latin American Perspectives pretty recently. And it comes out of a journey that I made in which I always assumed that the Brazilian state was patrimonial. It was something I was trained to believe, and it was something that I thought was confirmed in the literature and confirmed in the evidence that I encountered about Brazilian politics. And I sort of began to question it when I saw how varied the use of the term was in the literature and how many different things it seemed to mean. That the Brazilian state was patrimonial, that the Brazilian society was patrimonial. And it sort of led me on a journey to try to understand what people meant by this and whether we could really say that the state was patrimonial. And so it's kind of a journey of, it's a journey of discomfort, really, leading to a place where I now think it's kind of, well, I should cut to the chase, I suppose, cut to the suspense. But I'm not convinced anymore that it really is a patrimonial state, and I'll try to explain why. I'll try to convince you that this journey can be meaningful to other people. So I want to just talk about why I think the question's important, and then talk about two theorists who I think are fundamental to understanding this, and that's Max Weber, because we're going back to Weber and looking at the genealogy of the concept, but then looking at a guy called Raimundo Farol, who was a Brazilian lawyer and author of a kind of masterwork called The Owners of Power. It's actually a Gaúcho, I think, from Gabriel Estate. And this is one of these great classics about Brazil that hasn't been translated into English. There are a lot of them, but this is one that Brazilians refer to a lot and see as a kind of key to their society. And I want to contrast Farol with Weber, because I think the introduction of the term into Brazil changed the nature of what was being argued, and then look at some recent examples. And the last little bit, this third section, is more empirical, and it's a little bit of information on the Brazilian federal bureaucracy, which I want to try to convince you that recent changes in the way that the Brazilian state is constituted, the way the staff are recruited into the state, throws into question this assumption that a lot of people have, which is that the state is patrimonial. So why ask the question? I think because good concepts in political science are often generalizations in disguise. That's a term from Bendix. They come with a lot of assumptions, and sometimes the most influential concepts are the ones that are never really tested in research. They're just, you start off with the assumption. And I want to argue that if you look at the way patrimonial is used in the analysis of politics in Brazil, it's been quite stretched. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. So, but it does make sense. It intuitively makes sense. So it's not only that I was trained to believe that the Brazilian state was patrimonial, but it seemed intuitively correct. I mean, Brazil was the largest slave-owning society in the world in the 19th century. The foundation of the society is the patriarchal slave-owning household. So when you see that history, you think, of course the state would reflect those origins. It makes sense that the state would be the kind of state that Weber described as patrimonial, in that there was a kind of fusion of personal and public power. There wasn't really a distinction between the public and the private, and that politics was about, in the colonial period, it was called being friends of the king. You know, the closer you were to the king, the more power you had, and it was all very personalistic, and it all mixed public and private. So, and I'm using this Bob Jessup notion of the state because I'm mainly interested in, as I try to show in the third section, I'm going to try to take the discussion back to the public administration, the nature of public administration. You could go in a lot of different directions to test this idea of patrimonialism, but that's the evidence that I'm going to bring in, because I think that's fundamental. So another reason why I think this question that I'm asking is important is that patrimonialism is a big idea that is often presented in the literature as helping to explain what Brazil is in comparative terms. And these are some other ones. I don't have time to go into details on these, but these are examples of other sort of big ideas that are often used to present what Brazil is. So Gilberto Freire had a book called Casa Grande e Senzala, or The Big House and the Slave Quarters, and he was saying that's the historical foundation of Brazil. The Cordial Man is another. This has finally been translated into English, this one by Barco de Holanda in 2012. And this is about Brazilian cordiality, which a lot of people who, when they first go to Brazil, say, yeah, that's it. That's what this society is about. Everyone is so nice to the foreigner. Meanwhile, they're doing other things that they don't tell you about. So coronalismo is another idea, the idea of coronels, sort of leaders of these sort of rural militias, basically. So there's lots of these ideas. Coalitional presidentialism is one that's in the news a lot because that's a kind of concept about how presidents do or do not form working coalitions in Congress, and Dilma Rousseff didn't form one, which is why she's been impeached. It's also, patrimonialism has also trickled down to common parlance. So you see it in journalism a lot. This fellow, Minister of Finance Joaquim Levy, who was minister last year, he started off being Minister of Finance in January of 2015 saying, I'm going to end patrimonialism. And you might say patrimonialism ended him because he didn't last the year. He ended up resigning in December. But his idea, his notion of patrimonialism was all the systems of subsidies and tariffs and protections that industries and companies in Brazil got, which at that time, when he took over, was something like 0.8% of GDP, were going into these so-called sectoral programs, which were trying to prop up, especially in the manufacturing sector in Brazil. And he said, we're going to end this. We're going to have same rules for everybody. We're going to, we're going to substitute these sectoral programs with the market. But it didn't quite work out for him, at least. The surprising thing is, even though Brazil has this slave-owning past, and you'd think that patrimonialism as an idea would have been ever present in the literature in Brazil, it's pretty new. These are some interesting works that were from the 30s and 40s that don't use the term at all. Lowenstein was a Massachusetts-based political scientist who went down to Brazil and wrote a book about Brazil under Vargas. Again, doesn't use the term, so it's fairly new. So where does it come from? Well, I think the first significant book in Brazil on using the term was Raimundo Farol from 1958. And he was kind of an outlier for his time because the dominant scholarship in this period to understand the state was Marxist. And it assumed that the state reflected the economic base. And so if Brazil was an industrializing country, which it was at the time, it wasn't going to be patrimonial. It might have been dependent capitalist, but most of the Marxist scholars who were sort of dominant in the period didn't use it. So Raimundo Farol was a kind of lonely liberal voice saying that Brazil is patrimonial. But when you look at where he got the ideas and how he modified the ideas, how he adapted them, I think there's some very interesting transition. So in Weber, these are three elements, key elements of patrimonialism. The armed forces are personally loyal. The ruler gets his needs met through these collectivities, and the administration of the state is based on personal loyalty to a leader. So what patrimonialism is not in Weber, and Weber's writing is very confusing about this because he uses a lot of adjectives and he talks a lot about subtypes, but I would say this that I've put in bold is the essence of patrimonialism is not for Weber. It's a rational legal public bureaucracy where you have a system of recruitment based on exam, some other kind of measure of performance. You have training, you have promotion that's rationalized, long-term civil service careers, competitive salaries, and orientation to objective state interests. I think it's maybe how the administrators of British universities think their faculty. So what's interesting about Farol, when he takes this idea, he turns it into something very different. For Farol, unlike Weber, he's not interested in patrimonialism as a subtype or a type of state that you find all through human history and in lots of different places. He's really interested in what happened in Brazil. And he thinks that the Portuguese mercantilist state was sort of uniquely patrimonial. It marks Brazil really from the very beginning of colonialism. His analysis reminds me a little bit of Robert Putnam making Democracy Work, where the difference between North and South Italy is pretty much set in the 12th century. And that's it. So I call Farol a Luso pessimist, in that he's constantly lamenting the fact that Brazil was, maybe lamenting is too strong a word, but he's drawing attention back to the fact that the Portuguese colonized Brazil and not the Dutch and not the English and not the French. And the Portuguese had this particular type of state in which the high officials formed a kind of status group and ruled for their own benefit. And no matter what happened to the state, no matter whether it became apparently more sophisticated, apparently more meritocratic, that status group was always going to dominate it and rule in its own interests. So for Weber, patrimonialism is a kind of an it's a traditional form of rule, and it tends to phase out as you go to industrial capitalism. For Ho, it never dies. It just keeps recreating itself. And he starts the book. The book is a kind of long historical book where he starts in the 14th century. And he goes up and he shows how these elements don't change. So there's a great passage in the book near the end where he talks about, in place of renovation, the Lusitanian embrace produced a social enormity in which old cadres and anachronistic institutions frustrate the growth of the virgin world. So for him, this status group within the state is really responsible for a lot of the limitations of Brazil as he saw it in the late 50s. So he talks about the lack of a true civil society, the dominance of state over society, the lack of a real a national market, and also the divorce between leaders and subjects, the legitimacy gap between leaders who talk about national programs and national plans in very formalistic ways, and the great bulk of the population who feel completely, who don't really understand these ideas and who are looking for salvation in their daily lives. So he attributes the nature of the state to, he accounts for a lot of the ills of the country in terms of this patrimonial. So what I find interesting is that Faro was pretty much ignored at the time he published his book. The book didn't really make didn't have a lot of admirers, didn't have a lot of imitators. But in the 70s and 80s, you started getting more work using the patrimonial term. So these are some gringo academics who use patrimonialism, but you also get writers like D'Oliveira, Marilena Chiui, and I've got to sort of accelerate the pace of the problem, but one of the things I'd like to argue, I know this is a lot of text, it's probably too much, but my point here is that there's conceptual stretching in that the people who write using the term are talking about lots of different things. They're talking about corruption, they're talking about nepotism, they're talking about the kind of state capitalism that you have. And this difference between Chiui and Riordan-Rouet, an American political scientist, I think epitomizes some of these differences. So for Chiui, patrimonialism is expressed in the way neoliberal reforms are done, because neoliberal reforms are done by personalistic presidents who want to be fathers of the nation, and they sort of use autocratic power to push through reforms. And for Riordan-Rouet, it's exactly the opposite. Neoliberal reforms actually are reducing patrimonialism because they're reducing the size of the state and they're eliminating areas for patronage. So very quickly, what do I want to do here is say, okay, there's a lot of confusion in the literature. There's a lot of different uses of the term. People seem to mean different things. Let's go back to Weber and just have a quick overview of the public administration at the federal level. And what I want to show you is that I think if you think of what isn't patrimonialism as that kind of meritocratic, professionalized bureaucracy, you've actually had significant developments in the last 30 years towards that kind of bureaucracy in Brazil. So what I found was, this is an interesting piece by Steve Topic, a historian up at UC Santa Barbara, where he doesn't find the 19th century state to be particularly patrimonialistic. In other words, he finds that the part of the state that dealt with exports and finance to be quite bureaucratic, quite rational legal, even if many other parts of the state were not. Then you have, this is a, kind of doing violence to history. It's a very quick sketch of some of the things that happened. But under Getúlio Vargas, the dictator who came in the 1930s and sort of had a dictatorship from 37 to 45, Vargas was helped to create a program called DASPI, which was a part of the federal bureaucracy which was trying to professionalize public administration. And it kind of so by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s, the DASPI reforms, the professionalization that DASPI tried to run through, were being replaced by a system which was mainly patronage-based. So you went back to a system where most of the appointments in the federal level were were not meritocratic. They weren't exam-based. They were just friends of the king, if you like. They were appointed. But what I want to say is that with democratization, so you had a dictatorship in Brazil from 64 to 85. In 85, you had a return to civilian rule. You had a constitution that was passed in 88. And this is where I think the real transformation of the way that at least the top level of the federal bureaucracy was recruited, where that starts to change. And so I'm citing here so you look at some of these ministries like Central Bank, Treasury, National Development Bank, Planning, Foreign Ministry. They look a bit like that ideal type Weberian bureaucracy. They may not completely perform like that, but in their formal structure, they look like that. And so you get a large number of exam-based recruitment into the federal bureaucracy. So these reforms that come in the 80s and the 90s make the civil service look like at the type of civil service that didn't exist prior to that time, and even so presidents in Brazil appoint about 20,000 people to the top level, which is a lot more, I think, than the U.S. I think that the U.S. is something like 4,000 when a presidential administration comes in. But almost 3/4 of these appointments are now civil servants. They're almost, and that's been legally required. So I guess I have to keep moving. But this is the piece that, for some reason, Latin American Perspectives didn't want to publish this with the article. They just used a boring table instead. And I tried to convince the editor of the journal that this was the best piece of evidence I had, and they had to use it because it's the cumulative pattern of employment in the bureaucracy with the blue line representing those people who entered by exam and the red line representing those people who were appointed without an exam. And and I said, this is the best thing that you could put in the article because, you could cut all the verbiage and just look at that and say, that's what I'm trying to say. That's why I think the patrimonial thesis has to be qualified. Now, I know that's not the only way. You can measure it in all kinds of different ways. There's lots of elements to it. But if you take as central the idea that the people in the administration are personally loyal to the leader and they're there to serve that person's interests, that's not what you see now, at least at this level. Now, interestingly, the state-owned firms are not subject to the legislation that produced this pattern. So Petrobras, the state-owned oil company, is full of patronage appointments, which is one of the reasons why Petrobras is now the focus of the anti-corruption investigations. Because this may be going way off-piste, but I would argue that even that is not necessarily patrimonial, because what we seem to get in the car wash investigation, what the investigators are saying is that this was largely party corruption. It was largely corrupt. It was largely kickbacks to finance campaigns managed by political parties. So even that, I would argue, is not patrimonialism in the sense of serving in a personalistic way a particular leader, but it's party-based. But that's not my main point. So I should go to the conclusion and say, at least at this level, at least if you take the commanding heights of the federal bureaucracy, the sort of unstated and unquestioned assumption that what you have in Brazil is patrimonial needs to be qualified by looking at this kind of data. And I have to say, I got that data. The graph comes from a publication called the Statistical Bulletin of Personnel, that's done by the Ministry of Planning, and it's got to be the most boring publication I have ever had to deal with. And I had to go through year after year, Bulletin Statistico Pessoal. So I made a sacrifice to find this. But I really, and now I don't want to overstate because I know at the municipal level, and this is just anecdotal, but we have stories of mayors who come in and completely change who works for the local government. That's still possible. We know that. States more professionalized level. So I don't want to say that the whole state has been renovated into some kind of variant. I would concede that if formal recruitment patterns are based on exams rather than appointments, that doesn't mean that people can't be quite partisan, that they can be pursuing personal and political ends in their function. It doesn't mean that they're very ideal type bureaucrats. There's plenty of room for a sort of Faro vision that still about protecting certain personal or private interests. It doesn't mean that the public prevails. But here's another qualification of the argument. I do acknowledge that people's perception of politics is very important. And people in Brazil still perceive politics in many cases to be about who's a friend of the king and who isn't. Right? So there's a critique by Chico de Oliveira, who says, look at Lula as president. He gave some money to the poor, but he gave millions to the rich because they were the ones buying the treasury bonds and financing the public debt. And so he's more of a friend of them than he is of the poor. Patrimonial reading of what's going on. I mean, the debt is there are markets, right, for selling government. This isn't Lula deciding I'm going to make you wealthy by giving It's a kind of impersonal, structured relationship, but people still see that in many cases as patrimonial. As long as people see power, patrimonial is still there in a subjective sense, no matter what's happening at the level of recruitment and federal bureaucracy. So finally, so that's my conclusion, and then it's a prelude, really, to what I want to do next, because what I'd like to do is a book that tries to understand the Brazilian state in a slightly different way and say, okay, if I've convinced you that the state isn't patrimonial, at least in one sense, what is it, and how do we understand the capacity of the Brazilian state? Because it doesn't fit the stereotypes either. I read Francis Fukuyama's chapter on Latin America in his Political Order book, and it's a very small chapter, and it's about what Latin America isn't. And it's a state where states were not effective. They were underdeveloped, and it's a question of, why this dog didn't bark. And I thought, well, the Brazilian state takes 35% of the GDP in revenue. It's a big state. It affects a lot of people's lives. It's not this underdeveloped, puny entity that Fukuyama seems to think it is. And so I wanted to look at 4 agencies that I think have shaped citizenship and that are effective in a certain way. So the National Development Bank, the Federal Police, the Federal Public Ministry, and the Ministry of Public. That's a mistake there. That should be Ministry of Social Development. So that's the ministry that administers Bolsa Familia, the conditional cash transfer program. And the argument, the sort of intuitive insight here is that states are sediments. They're sediments. They're a mixture of entities that were created at different times, at different notions of state relations, and sort of embed those citizen-state relations, and get and then through sedimentation you get this mix. So I wanted to do some archival research on either the foundation or the reorganization of these entities that kind of set them on their way, and then try to look at how they changed. So I mean, it's selective. These are pieces of it, but that's what I want to do in terms of future research.